What if I told you that everything you think you know about money is a lie? That the paper bills in your wallet aren't actually money at all, but something entirely different? And that this deception has been deliberately hidden from you your entire life? Today we're diving deep into one of the most important distinctions you'll ever learn. A distinction that could literally save your financial future. This is the hidden truth about money versus currency, and once you understand this, you'll never look at your finances the same way again. I'm about to reveal secrets that the banking system doesn't want you to know. Secrets that have been used by the wealthy elite for centuries to transfer wealth from the masses directly into their own pockets. And the crazy part, most people have no idea this is even happening. They're being robbed in broad daylight, and they're actually thanking their robbers for the privilege. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. When you hear the word money, what comes to mind? If you're like most people, you probably think of dollar bills, credit cards, or maybe numbers in your bank account. But here's the shocking truth that will blow your mind. None of those things are actually money. They're currency. And there's a massive difference between the two that almost nobody understands. And finally, real money must be durable, portable, divisible, and have intrinsic value. This is the key to understanding why the middle class is disappearing, why it's getting harder and harder to build real wealth, and why the gap between rich and poor keeps growing wider every single year. The people who understand this difference become wealthy. The people who don't get left behind. So what exactly is the difference between money and currency? Let's start with money, real money. Throughout human history, real money has always possessed certain specific characteristics. First, it must be a store of value. That means it maintains its purchasing power over long periods of time. For thousands of years, gold and silver have perfectly fulfilled all these requirements. They've been recognized as money across every culture, in every era of human history. Why? Because they have intrinsic value. They're rare, they're beautiful, they're useful in industry and jewelry. And most importantly, they can't be created out of thin air by governments or central banks. But here's where things get interesting. What we use today, what we call money, doesn't meet any of these criteria. The paper dollars in your wallet, the digits in your bank account, they're not money at all. They're currency. And currency is simply a medium of exchange by government decree. It only has value because the government says it does and forces you to accept it through legal tender laws. Think about it this way. If you were stranded on a desert island with $1 million in cash, what would that paper be worth to you? Absolutely nothing. You couldn't eat it, you couldn't drink it, you couldn't build shelter with it. It has no intrinsic value whatsoever, but if you had $1 million worth of gold, that gold would still be valuable. It would still be gold with all its inherent properties and uses. This distinction becomes even more critical when you understand what's been happening to our currency over the past 50 years. In 1971, President Nixon made a decision that changed the entire global financial system forever. He took the United States off the gold standard completely. This meant that for the first time in history, the entire world was operating on a purely fiat currency system. Fiat means by decree or by force. In other words, our currency only has value because the government says it does. But here's the terrifying part. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost over 90% of its purchasing power. 90%. That means if your grandparents had $100 in 1971, it would only buy about $10 worth of goods today. This isn't inflation in the traditional sense, this is currency debasement, the systematic destruction of the currency's value through endless printing and creation of new money supply. Every time the government spends money it doesn't have, every time the Federal Reserve creates new dollars out of thin air to buy government bonds, every time banks create credit through fractional reserve lending, more currency units enter the system. And when you increase the supply of anything without increasing the demand, the value of each individual unit goes down. It's basic supply and demand economics. But here's where it gets really insidious. This currency creation doesn't affect everyone equally. The people who receive the newly created currency first, mainly banks and government, get to spend it at yesterday's prices. By the time that new currency works its way through the economy and reaches regular people like you and me, prices have already started rising. This is called the Cantillon effect, and it's one of the primary mechanisms by which wealth gets transferred from the poor and middle class to the wealthy and well-connected. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. So when the Federal Reserve creates new dollars to buy government bonds, they're essentially creating purchasing power out of nothing and giving it to the government. The government then spends this new money, and whoever receives it first gets to spend it before prices have adjusted to account for the increased money supply. Meanwhile, people holding existing dollars see their purchasing power slowly eroded as prices rise across the economy. This is why assets that can't be printed or created out of thin air tend to rise in price over time when measured in fiat currency. Real estate, stocks, commodities, and especially precious metals all tend to increase in price not because they're necessarily becoming more valuable, but because the currency used to measure their price is becoming less valuable. Understanding this dynamic is absolutely crucial if you want to build and preserve wealth in today's economic environment. While most people are trying to save currency, trying to accumulate more dollars in their bank accounts, the smart money is moving into real assets, things that maintain their value or even increase in value as the currency loses its purchasing power. This brings us to one of the most important concepts in all of finance, Gresham's law. This law states that bad money drives out good money from circulation. In other words, when people have both good money and bad money, they'll spend the bad money and save the good money. We see this principle at work everywhere throughout history. For example, when the US had both gold coins and paper dollars backed by gold, people would spend the paper dollars and save the gold coins because they instinctively understood that the gold had more permanent value. When governments started debasing their silver coins by reducing the silver content, people would spend the debased coins and save the pure silver coins. Today, we're seeing Gresham's law play out on a global scale. Countries and individuals who understand the difference between money and currency are quietly accumulating gold and silver while spending their fiat currencies. Central banks around the world have been buying gold at record levels in recent years, even as they tell their citizens that gold is a barbarous relic with no place in the modern financial system. But here's what really shows you how the game is rigged. While central banks and wealthy individuals are accumulating real money in the form of precious metals, they're encouraging everyone else to keep their wealth in depreciating currency. Financial advisors tell you to keep your money in savings accounts earning 1 or 2% interest while inflation runs at 4, 5, or even higher percentages annually. They're essentially telling you to guarantee that you'll lose money every single year. The reason this system persists is because it benefits those in power enormously. When you can create currency out of thin air, you have unlimited purchasing power. You can buy real assets, you can fund wars, you can expand government programs, all without having to tax people directly or ask their permission. It's the ultimate form of hidden taxation. But the system only works as long as people have confidence in the currency. Throughout history, every single fiat currency has eventually collapsed when people lost faith in the government's ability to maintain its value. The Roman denarius, the German Reichsmark, the Zimbabwean dollar, the list goes on and on. In fact, the average lifespan of a fiat currency is only about 27 years. The US dollar has been a pure fiat currency for over 50 years now, which means it's already lasted longer than the historical average. But there are warning signs everywhere that confidence in the dollar is starting to crack. Countries are starting to trade with each other in their own currencies instead of dollars. Central banks are diversifying away from dollar reserves. Even some states within the US are starting to explore alternative forms of money. So what does this mean for you personally? It means you need to start thinking like the wealthy elite and start converting some of your depreciating currency into real money. You need to understand that saving currency is actually a losing strategy in the long term, because currency always loses value over time due to inflation and money printing. Instead, you should be thinking about how to preserve and build your wealth using assets that can't be printed or created out of thin air. This might include precious metals like gold and silver, real estate, productive businesses, or other real assets that maintain their value independent of the currency system. But here's the key insight that most people miss. You don't need to abandon the currency system completely, you just need to understand how to use it to your advantage. Currency is excellent as a medium of exchange for daily transactions. It's convenient, it's widely accepted, and it makes commerce possible. But it's terrible as a store of value over long periods of time. The wealthy understand this distinction perfectly. They use currency for transactions and cash flow, but they store their wealth in real assets that appreciate over time. They borrow depreciating currency to buy appreciating assets, essentially using the system's own inflation against itself. This is why financial education is so incredibly important. The school system doesn't teach you about the difference between money and currency. They don't explain how the monetary system really works or how currency creation transfers wealth from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset owners. They keep you focused on getting a job and saving currency, which ensures that you'll never build real wealth. But once you understand these principles, you can start making decisions that align with how the system actually works rather than how you've been told it works. You can stop being a victim of currency debasement and start being a beneficiary of it. Here's another crucial point that ties everything together. The transition from a currency system back to a monetary system is inevitable. History shows us that all fiat currency systems eventually collapse under the weight of their own excess. When that happens, people always return to real money, to gold and silver, because these metals have the properties that make them excellent stores of value. We're already seeing early signs of this transition. More and more people are waking up to the difference between money and currency. Cryptocurrencies, while not perfect, represent an attempt to create money that can't be manipulated by central authorities. Precious metals are becoming increasingly popular among younger generations who see through the fiat currency illusion. The question isn't whether this transition will happen, but when it will happen and how quickly. Those who understand the difference and position themselves accordingly will benefit enormously. Those who don't will find their wealth destroyed along with the currency system. But here's the most important thing to understand about all of this. You don't need to wait for the system to collapse to start benefiting from this knowledge. You can start today by simply changing how you think about money and currency. Instead of trying to accumulate more currency, start thinking about how to accumulate more real wealth. This might mean buying precious metals as insurance against currency debasement. It might mean investing in real estate or other hard assets. It might mean starting a business that generates cash flow. The specific strategy isn't as important as understanding the underlying principle. Currency loses value over time, while real assets tend to maintain or increase their value. The people who prosper in any economic system are those who understand how the system really works, not how it's supposed to work or how they've been told it works. They adapt their strategies to reality rather than trying to make reality conform to their beliefs. Right now, we're living through one of the most important monetary transitions in human history. The decisions you make today about how to store and preserve your wealth will determine your financial future for decades to come. You can either be part of the group that gets left behind when the currency system inevitably changes, or you can be part of the group that benefits from understanding these hidden truths. The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking. Every day that goes by, more currency is created, more value is transferred away from currency holders to asset owners, and the eventual reckoning gets closer. The time to act is now, while you still have the opportunity to convert your depreciating currency into real, lasting wealth. And this has been just the beginning of understanding how money and currency really work. There are deeper layers to this story, more sophisticated strategies for protecting and building wealth, and more shocking revelations about how the system really operates. But now you have the foundation, the key insight that changes everything. The difference between money and currency, and why that difference will determine your financial future.